Okay, so you can see the note packet in front of me. You'd be looking at the PowerPoint presentation, which is on the computer screen. But if I show you this on the computer screen, it's going to look all wavy and funny. So we're just going to look at a paper version. I could read you this first slide down here, but you can read it also. And you're not going to get anything else about me reading it to you than if you just read it yourself. So some of these slides we're just going to skip over. That doesn't mean you should skip over them. That means that you should go through and read and figure out if there are important vocab terms or things like that that I may ask. So if I skip over a slide, that doesn't mean that you should skip over a slide. So the first thing that I highlighted down here, which is on the bottom slide, prokaryotic cells lack a true nucleus or organelles that have membranes. So what a true nucleus is a nucleus that has a membrane. So prokaryotic cells do not have a nucleus that has a membrane. I underlined that and I wanted to add that to this video because that's going to be a recurring theme in this class that we will talk about repeatedly. So I wanted to make sure that we touched on that. Any of the pictures in the printed packets don't look very good. I usually just reference them on the board, but they'll look very good on your slideshow on the PowerPoint. So you can look at that image there. Okay, first thing that we really need to get into. So starting on this slide and going to that slide is talking about endosymbiosis. So what I would like you to do, and I wrote it over here, I don't know if you can see that very well in the video, I'd like you to read this slide and this slide and then compare it to this picture. And then I feel like the picture should make sense with what's described in the two slides there. Again, I don't know that I need to word by word explain what you see there, but I think if you do it in that order, that those slides will make good sense. We talked about prokaryotic cells a second ago. This is another big point. So eukaryotic cells are like maybe not the opposite, but there's two categories of cells on Earth, prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells. And we said prokaryotic cells do not have a membrane around the nucleus, and eukaryotic cells do. So that's the fundamental. If you had to know one thing about prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells, it should be that the eukaryotic cell, which would be like your cells or your dog's cells, they have a membrane around their nucleus, where prokaryotic cells, so things like bacteria, they do not. Still on the next slide, so I went straight from that slide to the next one. Make sure you know those three parts of cell theory. That'll be a quiz question. It's those first 3 bullet points. But again, that should more or less make sense to you, I think. Cells can only come from the reproduction of a pre-existing cell. I mentioned this to my in-person students. It doesn't really account for where the first cell came from. That's something that we don't actually fully understand. I'll give you a possibility of how that may have happened in, I think, the next video. This slide's an important slide talking about the cell membrane because we'll talk about it more in the future. So make sure you look at that, and words like hydrophilic. Hydro means water, philic means likes, and then hydrophobic. Hydro obviously still means water, phobic means fears. So those words should make a little more sense now. But we'll talk about the cell membrane more in the future, so that will be important. This slide, again, the picture doesn't look great. If you look at it on your computer, it'll be better. I just want you to know what you're looking at. So this is like I drew a really crappy orange here. And so the box there is if I cut the orange in half, and I'm looking at the inside of the orange. So that part of the orange, if this is the cell, that's the cell membrane. That's how I explained that in class, and everybody seemed to understand, so I hope that made sense. So that part of the orange, because a cell is roughly circular, oranges are roughly circular, so we cut that orange in half, and now we can see the inside edge of the rind. This would be the inside edge of the cell membrane. I just wanted you to understand what you're looking at in that slide in the PowerPoint. This slide about the nucleus is also an important slide. Again, just make sure you read it. You're familiar with vocab terms like nuclear envelope and nuclear pores and enzymes. This slide about DNA sequence and amino acid sequence, the next slide I'll get to in a second. But before I do that, make sure you know the 3 parts of a nucleotide: a 5-carbon sugar, a phosphate group, and one of the nitrogen bases. That'll be a recurring theme in this class also. That's on probably 3 or 4 of the quizzes. If you don't, you might as well just learn it now, because that's going to be something we talk about a lot in the future. The previous slide and this slide, if you didn't understand it completely, it's okay. That's going to be something we talk about a lot in the future in a different section. So that was just kind of an introduction. So I'm just going to let that go, read through it, see if it kind of makes sense. And if it doesn't, we'll get that with more detail later. Okay, so last big thing to talk about is passive transport and active transport. So the difference is, think of the words passive and active. If you are passive about something, you probably kind of don't care. And if you are actively engaged in something, you're like really trying. So passive transport, we're moving things across the cell membrane and the cell's not putting forth any energy or effort to do that. Active transport, we were having something cross the cell membrane and the cell is really putting forth energy. It really wants that to happen. So that's the main difference between those 2 points. There's 4 types of passive transport. They're outlined on the next several slides. They should more or less make sense if you read through them. And so then active transport, there's 3 types: endocytosis, exocytosis, and types of cell membrane pumps. And again, those should mostly make sense. I'm going to explain a type of cell membrane pump a little bit. Before I do that, in this picture, this top image, when you look at that on the PowerPoint, that's endocytosis, and the bottom image is exocytosis, if that didn't make complete sense from the heading. In both images, and I drew this here, I don't know if you can see it very well or not, this part up here is outside of the cell, so that little line right here is the cell membrane. Same thing down here, so that's outside the cell. That little line is the cell membrane. And then so down here is inside the cell. I think in the video, in the PowerPoint, this will be blue and this will be tan. So the tan part's the inside of the cell, the blue part's the outside of the cell. And so then the sodium-potassium pump, if you read this paragraph and then apply what you read to this slide and this slide, I think that it should pretty well make sense. If we zoom in down here, it says, it's hard to read on the paper, but it'll be visible on the slide. It says extracellular and intracellular. So this is the outside of the cell. That's the inside of the cell. This is the cell membrane. This little kind of bell-shaped thing that changes shape, that's the carrier protein. And these little red dots, I think they're yellow on the PowerPoint. Those are sodium ions. And then that's an ATP molecule that attaches to the carrier protein. But again, if you read this part, this description should make sense as to where the sodiums are going, why the carrier protein changes shape, so on and so forth. And then this is the second half of that description you read on the previous slide, except now we have potassium ions entering the carrier protein. And then we'll have 3 new, I forgot to color those red, but we have 3 new sodium ions going to enter that carrier protein, and we're going to do it all again. And that's the end of this video. So what I'd like you to do, now that you've watched the video, is make sure you read through the notes. if you have any questions, send me an email, and if you don't, then I'll send out the quiz sometime this week, probably towards the end of this week, because you folks will take the quiz the day after my in-class students take the quiz. So I hope this helped. In the future, we might have a little bit more of an in-depth video, but for this first section, that was it. So, like I said, if you have questions, feel free to send me an email.